Today, I address a question that I'm asked quite often. Is the Epiphone Les Paul Custom a real Les Paul? Now, you may think that I'm blurring the lines between real and true, but I don't think it matters. It's also important that you note that I'm not saying that the Epiphone is a real Gibson Les Paul. Let's get after it. So here's the scenario. Someone goes out, spends their hard-earned money on a guitar that they've gone into a guitar shop, played, absolutely bonded with, and loves that guitar. They take it home, they play it, it's awesome. They go out somewhere and they're playing it and someone says, hey, that's not a real Les Paul, that's an Epiphone, that's not a Gibson. Well, that person is a douchebag because this is a real Les Paul. It's not a real Gibson Les Paul. And to be honest, it's not a true Les Paul. A lot of the Les Pauls that are out there now that aren't at the custom shop level aren't really true Les Pauls. They're takes on them or the evolution of them. And yes, I know before the one or two guys that think they're geniuses and comment, the only true Les Paul is the log, so, you know, thanks. So what I want to do here is address a few things. And again, this is something that I've been asked to do ever since I did the Gibson Les Paul Studio a real Les Paul, which again, yes. But I've always been asked to do stuff on Epiphone guitars, and especially the Epiphone Les Paul Custom. So I figured since I rented one, we'll do that. So I want to first do a comparison spec-wise to some of the Gibson Les Pauls that I own. So I also have to be a bit of a D-bag here and say I own 13 Gibson Les Pauls. That's not a pat on the back, that's not a flex. I have a legit problem. I just love Les Pauls and Strats and, well, just guitars in general. So I've chosen 3 Gibson Les Pauls to do just a spec comparison with. So we're going to start out with the Gibson Les Paul Studio. This is a different one that I used in the Gibson Les Paul Studio, a real Les Paul, whatever video. So this one's a little different, it has a wider fretboard, wider neck, so it doesn't get a lot of play because I usually play like multiple Les Pauls when I'm recording, and it's just weird to go from, you know, like, oh, they all feel the same to this is a little wider. So the Gibson Les Paul Studio here, we have an unbound body. It has a carved maple top on top of a slab mahogany body. We have an unbound rosewood fretboard, a silk-screened Gibson logo, and this is a Les Paul 100 model, so a silk-screened Les Paul 100 signature. We also have a set mahogany neck. And if we were to remove the maple cap here, what you would see, this is a weight-relieved Les Paul. So there's a whole bunch of different routings and holes and cavities in here. What that does is it makes the guitar lighter while keeping the sustain, and it increases the resonance that you feel when you're playing it. So there's a little more low end to it. Next up, we'll take a look at the Gibson Les Paul Standard 50s. This is what most people think of when they think of Les Paul, a Les Paul Standard. So we have a bound maple cap, carved maple cap on top of a slab of mahogany for the body. We have an inlaid Gibson logo with the Les Paul model silk screened on the headstock. We have a bound rosewood fretboard, a set mahogany neck, and if we were to remove the maple cap here, you would see the only routings in here would be for the cavities for the controls. So this is considered a non-weight relieved Les Paul. This is a lot heavier. What that does, again, maintains the sustain. Les Pauls and sustain go together. But this increases the presence that you overall feel when you're playing. And to be honest, I just love a weight relieved or non-weight relieved Les Paul. The heaviness, it's just, I feel a little more when I'm playing it. It's kind of hard to talk about an Epiphone Les Paul Custom if we don't talk about a Gibson Les Paul Custom. This is a 1988 Gibson Les Paul Custom Showcase Edition. And boy, has it been played. I love this thing. I play it as much as I possibly can. But we have a bound maple cap, a carved maple cap, on top of a slab of mahogany. Now, this is a Les Paul Custom, so we also have binding on the back. And to the one guy there that keeps saying, why do people say that bound bodies or binding changes the sound? It doesn't. It feels different. What's awesome about body binding, this is just a personal preference here, and a quirk, I guess you would say, over the years, the wood expands and retracts and everything like that. And the binding basically stays the same. So you get little indentations around the body binding, and it's just super comfortable. And it's one of those little quirks that I just love the feeling of. We have the inlaid Gibson logo and the inlaid, I think this is called the diamond logo. And we have a bound ebony fretboard, because Les Paul Customs generally come with ebony. And of course, if we were to remove the carved maple top, you would see that the only routings are for the controls. So this is a non-weight relieved Les Paul. Fan-freaking-tastic. Again, you're not going to feel as much resonance, or I sometimes call it puffy resonance, but you'll get a little more feeling in that presence. So when you're playing it, you'll feel a little more of the high end. So now that we got a baseline for some of the Les Paul specs, let's take a look at this Epiphone Les Paul Custom. So we have a bound carved maple top on top of a slab of mahogany. And again, this is a custom, so the slab of mahogany actually has binding on the back of it as well. We have the inlaid Epiphone logo with the inlaid diamond logo. A bound ebony fretboard. Again, this is a custom. And if we were to remove this carved maple top, you would see that the only routings here are for the controls. So this is a non-weight relieved Les Paul, and it feels awesome. So as far as specs go, this is a real Les Paul. It's not a real Gibson Les Paul. It does not have nitro finish. Made in China. Does that matter to you? It feels really good when playing it, so I don't know. But there's always the excuse of the pros. The pros play Gibson Les Paul standards, which is not really true. I've seen a lot of pro-level players that are playing studios, classics, different things like that. I've seen them when they're playing tributes. It's what is comfortable for them to play. Some of them like the weight relief. Some of them play the previous generation standards where it was all weight relieved and all the modern stuff in it. Whereas the current generations are non-weight relieved. But if you want to take a look at what some people call like the upper echelon of, pro players, they're not playing the Les Paul standards that you buy off the shelf generally. They're getting the custom shop ones. Some of them are getting different brands or different guitar makers to make them and send them, even with the logo saying Gibson on it. But most of those players, again, getting custom shops. So yeah, a lot of them are the either Les Paul Custom or their custom shop standards or whatever, whether they're like R4s, R7s, 8s, 9s, what have yous. Those are a lot of the most popular ones. I don't own any of those, at least not yet. But that's why generally you'll see, for those, the truss rod cover does not say standard, it's blank. Because that's a little more truer to the older Gibson Les Pauls, and it didn't say standard, it was just blank. That's also why you get a separate blank truss rod cover when you buy a Les Paul standard. Most of that comes down to comfort. Once you've started spending a little extra money on guitars, you start to feel little tiny differences, and it is usually little tiny differences that you really prefer. doesn't make you a better player overall, but in your mind, you're a little more comfortable with that. So in your mind, at least, it makes you a lot more comfortable, so you can, I don't know, dig in a little more, can feel it a little more, whether that's, you know, superficial or not. Superficial and music production go hand in hand. So to me, this is a real Les Paul. It is not a real Gibson Les Paul, and it's not a, if you want to look at the word, true Les Paul. Again, that's where you got to get into the nuanced stuff from the custom shop, because that's where they're going to take a little more attention to detail to, you know, what came before, rather than, you know, the evolution of the Gibson Les Paul. So I am going to play you out with probably some lead on the neck, because, oh God, that sounds awesome on a Les Paul. There's two things I do want to say here really quickly. This is the closest that I've ever bonded with an Epiphone guitar. A lot of that is to do with the fact that this is a non-weight relieved guitar. A lot of the proportions and stuff like that, they feel like a Gibson Les Paul, but it doesn't totally. It's definitely missing that nitro finish. Some people don't like nitro, so that's a plus if you don't like it. I miss it. I'm also, for some reason, I don't know why, when I'm switching from any other Gibson Les Paul to the Epiphone, it feels like I'm playing a pancaked body, so like, you know, two slabs of mahogany put together. I don't know if that's the case. That's just the feeling that I get, so something feels just a little off. And for some reason, the fretboard, the radius seems a little weird to me. This could just be in my head because I'm thinking that this is a pancake body. Maybe I'm looking too much for differences, but it looks like it has like a reverse radius where it's like, instead of, you know, a bit of a crown. That's not the case. That's just something that I'm feeling. So it's just a little off when it comes to, you know, from the 12th fret to the 22nd. The last thing I want to touch on here is none of that stuff matters. Guitar is all about preference. It's about what inspires you to play. If it motivates you to want to continue to play, to continue to learn. If you make weird faces when you're playing it because you're feeling things. I make really stupid faces. So if some idiot comes up to you and tries to put down the guitar that you own, that you love, that you just spent your hard-earned money on, and says it's not a real Les Paul because it's not a Gibson, say, who cares? You'll disarm them. It's one of those things, you know what I mean? You just don't pay attention to a bully. That guy's a bully. It doesn't matter. If you are bonding with a guitar, that's all that matters. Whether it says Epiphone, whether it says Gibson, whether it says LTD, ESP, Paul Reed Smith SE, S2, all of those things. It doesn't matter. It's what is most inspiring to you, what you're bonding with. Could be that all you can afford right now is the Epiphone, and it really works for you. That's awesome. You want to get that Gibson, get it down the line. But if this is working for you, don't discount it because of the name on the headstock. But I'm done talking here. Hopefully I've been a little bit helpful. Probably not. Who knows? But here's the Epiphone Les Paul Custom and just some sound samples with the Gibsons.